Okay, thank you for coming this afternoon to my Conservation Basics Masterclass. Now, I've seen some of the names of those of you attending, and I recognise quite a few of you, so most of you seem to know me, which is a little bit daunting, but here we go. Welcome to this masterclass, and I thought I'd start just by introducing myself. So let's get going. So introducing me, I left school in the late 1970s and went straight into surveying. I joined a company where I was a commercial property agent and dealt with property management as well as other bits and pieces. And I qualified in 1984. Thereafter, I joined a company in Essex and undertook building surveys, mortgage valuations and the like. It was during that time that one day I found myself in front of a timber-framed thatched building, and I thought, good grief, I haven't been trained to deal with this. So I thought it best to go and do some study and some homework, and I found out about it. And that's what got me interested in conservation. I've always had an interest in history. And so my interest in history and my interest in conservation in buildings came together in dealing with building conservation. In the late 1980s, there were no courses or anything, so a lot of it was by private study and just gradually getting to know people in the field, particularly conservation officers. However, in 1990, the RICS joined up with the College of Estate Management and created a diploma course, and I was one of the first cohort to go through that. We finished that in 1992, and I enjoyed that. But that got me onto the path of conservation. And thereafter, I decided that that's what I wanted to do. So I formed my own company in 1993. At about the same time, I joined the Conservation Officers Association, Association of Conservation Officers, which later became the IHBC. And about the same time, I became accredited and I became a fellow of the RICS. So that was my career up until the 1990s. I enjoyed a fairly good time as a sole practitioner during the 90s, but by the end of that period, I was getting a bit fed up of being on my own. And I'd met some other people, like-minded architects and surveyors, and I merged my company with Whitworth in 2000. Whitworth are a company of architects and surveyors, and I've been with them for the last 21 years. But I decided earlier this year to take, not early retirement, but to take a step backwards. And I ceased to be a partner. And I'm still working with them as a consultant, but I've decided to go in a different direction. And coaching and training is one of the things I want to do. As you'll see from the images that I've put on this slide, I've got a number of interests. And one of them being music, as you can see me making a horrible noise on a saxophone in one of the images. I'm a family man with a wife, 3 daughters and 2 grandchildren, and I love flying. So flying is one of my passions. If you ever find yourself at Duxford, you might find me up there as well. And I'm an artist as well. So one of the things I might be doing in the not too distant future is selling some art. Anyway, let's get on with the presentation. Now, earlier today, I put onto LinkedIn and the Surveyors Hub that this session was going to be called the 3 Ps of conservation, and I invited people to guess at what the 3 Ps were. There were some interesting guesses, but let's get on to that. So what are the 3 Ps as far as I'm concerned? Well, the 3 Ps are the past, pathology, and planning. The past being what happened before today, the history, what's gone on to bring the building that we see before us into what we, to see how it has evolved. Pathology, the cause and effect of deterioration or damage that might have occurred to that building over time. And planning, the process of implementing changes and dealing with repairs, etc., to the building. So those are the 3 Ps, and I want to explore those in more detail during this session. But before that, I want to look at the principle that underpins conservation as far as I am concerned, and that is understanding historic buildings. I would go as far as saying that, in fact, understanding buildings is the key thing about any surveying work we undertake. It's very difficult to assess a building or to consider change alteration in any way unless you properly understand it. Now, of course, with modern buildings, that tends to be easier because they've gone through less changes or fewer changes. And when it comes to historic buildings, we're looking at buildings that have evolved over time. And I've had situations where even the smallest, simplest buildings can involve 3 or more different structures within a small building. So it is important that we understand it, and we'll develop this later as we go through this session. I've looked at the Cambridge and Oxford dictionaries at their different definitions, and through that I've come up with my own definition of understanding historic buildings, and it is to be aware of the character and nature of a building and to know why and how it works. So now let's move on to the first of our P's, past. In my view, a knowledge of history is the most important thing. Without understanding the basic background of history, it makes it very difficult to understand the evolution of buildings. There are events that have occurred in history that have influenced the materials used, the design, and how buildings have evolved and been constructed over the time. Now, I'm not saying that we all need to be historians, but I do believe that if you're going to be successful in conservation, you have to at least have an interest and a basic understanding of history. And of course, then we look at the timeline of architectural styles, and they're often linked to the royal lineage. So let's just have a look at them. So the first batch, we start with the Tudor period, and we follow that with the Elizabethan and Jacobean period, closely followed by the Restoration. And then we get into the Queen Anne and then the Georgian period. Now, obviously, these deserve a lot more detailed investigation than I can give you this afternoon. But it is important to note that there are distinct characteristics through these periods. However, they don't suddenly stop and start. And one thing we need to be aware of is that changes happen slowly and things emerge as time goes on. And so therefore, when we think about the Elizabethan and Jacobean period, for example, it is during this period that some of the classical styles of architecture start to be seen in the grander buildings in the country. But it isn't until the Queen Anne period where we see that brought through to, if you like, the more common house types, certainly city centres with townhouses and so on and so forth. And we see that again in the Georgian period. So these things evolve over time and change. But then through the next period, we get the following. We get the Regency period, followed by the Victorian period. And you'd think that was followed by the Edwardian period, but in fact, stretching between the two and the Arts and Crafts period. And then after the Edwardian period, we get Art Deco. Now, this is where I'm really going to stop with my timeline for today. But again, we see a gradual evolution through this time of a couple of 100 years. And particularly the Victorian period, we see a lot of innovation and change, a lot of experimentation in building and materials. And that comes about partly by the scientific exploration that we see in that period, but it also follows on from the Industrial Revolution that had started in the previous century. But in this period, we also see a reaction against the classicism that we see in the Georgian period. And we start to see some changes there. And that brings about things like the arts and crafts movement or the Art Nouveau period. And then again, in the 20s, we see a further reaction with Art Deco. And here that is helped by modern manufacturing styles and the ability to create forms, geometric forms in particular, that previously would have been difficult. So as you can see, as we go through this timeline and start to understand how buildings can evolve, both in terms of their materials and their design, it is important that we understand this basic history, this basic timeline. But of course, there are other things that influence buildings, and these are the socio and economic factors. And here are just a few of the things that can influence buildings. Of course, one of the things you see up there is the Civil War. And war is, unfortunately, one of the significant influences on building. This is partly because it has a major economic influence. And you may have heard of things like window tax, brick tax, and so on and so forth. And many of these are brought about to fund war, which is sad, but that's the reality of it. It also means that there is a change in the workforce. For example, after the First World War, there was a reduction in manpower in certain industries, and that had a big influence on what happened in the interwar period. So war, unfortunately, does have a major impact, but there are other things as well. So, for example, religious persecution can have an influence because that creates migration. And then we get people moving around, and they bring with them or take with them their styles and materials that they've learned. So therefore, when we see the Pilgrim Fathers going over to America, they take with them the building materials and styles that they are used to working with, and they implement them in America. And when we think about those persecuted that come to the UK from the continent, we see, say, for example, the Flemish coming into East Anglia in particular, and they had a major influence on materials and style in that area. So it is important that we understand socio and economic factors. And I would encourage you to think about areas that you know, for example, towns and cities near you, and think about what factors influence them over history. So for example, our head office in Whitworth is in Bury St Edmunds. Now, Bury St Edmunds was a monastery town. The dissolution of the monasteries meant that it fell by the wayside at that time, but then it built up as a centre for marketing, as a market town. And through the centuries, it has remained prosperous. And therefore, what we see as we walk around the towns are the results of that prosperity being layered on top of the history of the buildings. And so if we unpick some of those buildings, we can find several layers of history as we go back through that building. However, there are towns where that hasn't happened. Now, one such town is Lavenham. Now, many of you will know Lavenham and think, well, it's a beautiful town of half-timbered buildings, and it is indeed a fantastic little town. But of course, its appearance comes about because of social decline. There was a period when it went through a very poor economic state, and because of that, it couldn't be upgraded, and there wasn't enough wealth for the buildings to be changed and refaced, etc., etc. And so what we see today is a result of that economic change. And so when we think about the buildings we deal with, the towns, the cities, it is important that we recognize the socio and economic factors that would have influenced the buildings when they were first constructed, but also as they have changed and altered over the centuries. But another major influence has been transportation. And here we think about roads. And on the left, you'll see an image of a Roman road. And we think, oh, the Romans built fantastic roads and we had a great road system. Well, maybe when the Romans were here, we did. But unfortunately, they went into decline. And through the period after the Romans, those roads were sometimes robbed of their stone and allowed to deteriorate. And so therefore, by the medieval period, the roads were much more like you see on the right. And in fact, that's an image I took quite recently of a medieval lane. And it is, in fact, more mud than anything else. And it goes between trees, and there is some stone on the surface, but it's not exactly as pleasant to go along as, say, the Roman road. Now, you may be thinking, why on earth am I talking about roads? Well, it affects transportation because for many centuries, the only ones that could afford to transport materials any distance were the rich. For the most part, buildings are constructed from materials that are locally sourced. And if we think about it, the difficulty of moving materials around by road was significant. Not only was the fact that the roads themselves were not particularly good, with the risk of highway robbery and so on and so forth. But of course, if you were transporting overnight, you had to find somewhere to put the cart, the horse, the carter, and lodge them overnight while you then moved them on the next day. And of course, the journey is repeated coming back. So the cost was significant. So generally, in the medieval and later periods, in fact, right up until fairly modern times, transportation was fairly local and dictated by the conditions at the time. And when we think about a cart ride away from a building, we're often thinking about probably no more than a few miles, maybe 5 miles or more, or thereabouts. So when we think about buildings, and vernacular buildings in particular, I would encourage you to look around you and say, what's in the locality? What is the geology under my feet? What sort of building materials might there be underneath me? What sort of existed on the land? Was it farmland? Was it forested? What sort of materials were available to build with in the locality? And sometimes we find clues in names. So, for example, if you come across somewhere called Lime Kiln Lane, it's pretty obvious that there might once have been a lime kiln nearby. If you come across an area called Brick Earth Road or Street or what have you, then it's likely that there was clay in the area that enabled them to create bricks. And so it's important that we understand the local area, its geology and makeup, and the sort of materials that would have been available. One of the things, one of the myths I come across quite frequently, especially with timber frame buildings, is that they are built of ship's timbers. In my, 35 years of dealing with conservation now, I've only found 2 buildings with ship's timbers that are obviously in them. And when we think about it, if a ship is going to be broken up, then it's generally going to be rotting. And do we really want to incorporate rotting timbers into our building? No, we don't. And the other thing is that ships will be broken up at the quayside or in local rivers, etc., etc. And they're not going to be transported any distance. And some of the buildings I've seen where the owners claim to have ship's timbers in them are miles from the nearest river. So obviously this is a bit of a myth. In fact, it comes about because after Henry VIII, and certainly during the Restoration period, when we built a fantastic navy, they needed oak for the ships. And what they did was they went around the country and identified the oak that they wanted for shipbuilding, and it was taken by royal decree to build the navy. And of course, these trees were marked, but not all of them were used. And therefore, some of them did become available for house building, but they had already been identified as timbers for ships. And that, I think, is where this myth comes from. Anyway, let's move on. So the next period we see is that of canals. And here you see some maps showing the late 18th century and into the 19th century where the canal system grew. And this was allied to the Industrial Revolution. And you'll see that the canals are focused on the main centres of the Industrial Revolution. And therefore we see quite a few in the Midlands and up north and around London, and to a lesser degree over to the southwest. And these are centres of the Industrial Revolution. And it helped that the materials can then be transported by canals and waterway. However, it was still the case that for the majority of house building, the cost was simply too much. And therefore, the main areas where we will see materials being transported, for example, slate from Wales into London or slate from the Lake District into London, would be by canal and by waterway into the main centres. And that's how, with Georgian buildings, we see many of them with slate roofs, because the material would have come by waterway and canal. However, for the majority of buildings, this was still too expensive. And so it wasn't until the era of the railway that we really see a major change. And here you'll see some maps showing the growth of the rail network and how significant it was. And you'll see that this is mainly through the Victorian and Edwardian period that the rail network grew. And this is when materials could be shipped all around the country, transported all around the country, and taken to far-flung places. And this is when we start to see materials that you wouldn't expect to appearing in certain areas. So for example, I've been to places in Suffolk where there is no natural slate, and seeing a Victorian building that had a slate roof, and from evidence it always had a slate roof, but that could have only got there because of the rail network. So by seeing when the railway came through into that town gives us a clue as to when that building might have been constructed. And so looking at the rail network and understanding that can help with understanding the evolution of building and building materials in particular. So just before we leave this section of looking at the history, let's think about a building's evolution, because this is what it's all about. So here we have a building somewhere in Essex. And in the 15th century, it started life as a medieval hall house, timber frame with 2 wings. It didn't have a chimney, the smoke's going through a hole in the roof. And that's a basic yeoman's house, as it were. Not necessarily the humblest of buildings, but certainly not necessarily a grand house either. But then in the 16th century, when there was a little bit more wealth about, they were able to put in a brick chimney. Now, it's not as if chimneys were a new invention by that time. After all, the Romans had chimneys serving their hypercourse, and many castles have chimneys. So the technology of chimneys was well known. It's just that most people couldn't afford them. But of course, by the 16th century, there was greater wealth generally in the country. And so chimneys started to be put in. And here we see in the 16th century a chimney being put in, and that meant they didn't have to have the upper void. So they were able to make use of that upper void by inserting an upper floor and sometimes raising the roof. Now, this does have implications for the structure, because sometimes with timber frame buildings, we see the frame simply hacked about to facilitate the insertion of these upper floors and doorways and so on and so forth. So that's the sort of thing we need to be aware of. And then in the 17th century, we see that this building has had a change to one of the wings. Now, the question here is, does this wing incorporate the old wing, or does it replace it? And that's part of what we as surveyors or architects dealing with these buildings would need to establish and assess as we go through the history of it and looking at it. And then, of course, we get into the 17th century, when more wealth means that this house might have been a slightly grander building occupied by a larger family, and they needed more space, and so it was extended in the style at that time. But of course, by the 18th century, they had enough money to get rid of this horrible medieval style and Georgianize it with this wonderful symmetrical classical front. And of course, this then meant that we have, in this instance, parapets, completely alien to the building up until this point. Rainwater discharged off the roof into, well, often just onto the ground, but later into gutters. But of course, now we're introducing parapets, and all of a sudden there's a fundamental change in how rainwater is dealt with. And these are the sort of things that are important to understand when we're looking at this sort of building. And then, of course, into the 19th and 20th century, when further alterations take place, again, due to style changes that come about. And in this instance, the roof was changed yet again. Did that roof go in to be changed because of the problems of the parapet gutter, or was it because they needed more space and they've raised the roof and created attic rooms? Those are the sort of questions that one needs to ask when looking at buildings. But there you have a basic evolution, and see how we get through from a hall house to quite a grand small country house today. Anyway, let's move on to our next of the P's, and that is the second P, the P of pathology. So here I want to think about the materials themselves, and I'm going to start by thinking about traditional versus modern materials. So traditional materials tend to be permeable, flexible, locally sourced, and they can be quite variable. And they tend to be crafted, in other words, handmade. And the build tended to be slower. Whereas with modern materials, they tend to be impermeable, inflexible or brittle, and they can be imported both from different parts of the country, as I've already discussed, but of course they could come from the other side of the world. They tend to be more constant because in the 20th century, we've had building standards and industrialization. That means we can produce fairly consistent materials, and they tend to be manufactured, some of them even being built in factories. And they can be rather fast builds as well. So there are differences. Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other, but what we need to understand is that there is a fundamental difference. And when we're dealing with historic buildings, we need to understand those differences and assess how those changes, if modern materials have been imposed on a historic building, how that might have affected the performance of that building. So here we see two cars. They look the same and they do the same. And to all appearances, they're two cars. What could be different about them? Well, of course, one is petrol and one is diesel. And if we put the wrong fuel in the wrong car, it won't work. And it's very similar with buildings. If we start using the wrong materials with buildings, there's a danger that we will cause problems and stop that building functioning and performing as it should do. So it's an important lesson to be learnt that the materials we use and impose on a building can have a major impact. Now, I often say that we cannot stop anything deteriorating. We can't stop the aging process, but what we do impacts the speed at which something might deteriorate. If we use the wrong materials, we can accelerate that rate of decay. If we use the correct materials or appropriate materials, then we can help slow down that rate of decay. And then we turn to the lime cycle. So the lime cycle is fundamental to understanding building conservation. It is one of the principal materials that we use when dealing with historic buildings. So the lime cycle starts with limestone or calcium carbonate, and it's quarried. Although there are examples of lime being sourced from other materials such as shells, but the main source of lime is going to be from a quarry. So we start with this calcium carbonate. The next thing we do is we burn it in a kiln. And there's an example of a kiln that I took recently in Clovelly in Devon. So we burn it in a kiln and that gives off carbon dioxide. And we end up with calcium oxide, which is known as quicklime or lump lime. Now, when we've got this material, we introduce water as quickly as possible and we combine it. This is called slaking. And it creates calcium hydroxide, which is in fact the slaked lime plus heat. Now, there are three methods that we can use when dealing with this. One is to use an excess of water, and that creates a putty, and that's perhaps one of the more common methods in the past and certainly in recent years. We can use a shortfall of water, and that creates a hydrated lime. But a method that has come about fairly recently and is rapidly becoming a very common method is to use damp sand, and that's called a hot mix. So those are the different methods by which we can combine the lime during the slaking process. And then, of course, we use it in the building. And we can use it in various ways. So on the left there, you'll see that it's been used as a render to rendered panels. And in the right-hand image, you'll see that it's been used to repoint and rebed brickwork or masonry. What happens is lime carbonation. This is where the lime absorbs water-soluble carbon dioxide from the air. And at this point, it becomes calcium carbonate again, and hence the lime cycle. So we start with limestone and we effectively end with limestone. And that's the lime cycle. And it is important, if we're dealing with building conservation, to basically understand that and the process. But now let's look at some of the primary issues I've found affect buildings over the years and cause most concern for building owners. The first is, of course, structural movement. The second is moisture or damp. And the third is timber rot and infestation. Now, moisture and timber defects are closely related, so I'll deal with those a bit later on. But let's just firstly consider movement. Now, there are various causes of movement, and of course, ground movement, whether it be because we're on a clay subsoil or landslip or even quarrying mining underneath, can cause ground movement. And those are things we need to be aware of. It goes back to understanding the geology of the area we're dealing with. But of course, we can have superstructure movement. Now, I mentioned earlier about buildings being altered. Now, sometimes those alterations lead to movement of the superstructure. And it's important to understand what is going on with that building to assess whether the movement we see is indeed due to some sort of superstructure movement or movement between different materials. We can also get expansion and contraction of materials, and we get deterioration through rot, chemical attack, etc. There are many different causes of that. But we need to understand that movement is sometimes quite complex, and there are a number of causes that we need to think about when we see buildings that exhibit signs of movement. And then we think about the repair options. Now, one of the mantras I use quite often is to do as much as necessary, but as little as possible. And what we need to appreciate is that we have options here. We can opt to do absolutely nothing. It may be that we decide that the problem is long gone and not active, and therefore we don't actually need to do anything about it. However, we may have a question: is it still active? Is there still a problem? So we might want to monitor it. We might find that there's a need for further investigation. And of course, sometimes there will be some obvious repairs needed. And of course, there will be those occasions when we need to undertake major structural intervention to prevent further deterioration. And we have to accept that sometimes demolition in part or in full is an option that can be considered, but it should be very much a last resort when we're dealing with historic buildings. So what about structural appraisal? Here I've created a bit of a flow chart. I'm not going to go through this in great detail here and now. It will be in the recording and in the PDF of the presentation that we'll send to you, and you can look at it in more detail. But it gives you an indication of how I view things when I go and look at a building to assess, is it safe, is it unsafe? What do I need to do about it? Can I monitor it and leave it alone, or do I need to interfere with it in some manner? So that's a flow chart that I've created that you're free to have a look at later, but hopefully you'll find that helpful. So now let's think about timber and damp. Damp is, of course, the most common cause of defects in the UK, and we should never underestimate the damage that can be caused by dampness. And of course, timber defects and dampness usually go hand in hand. But firstly, I'm going to look at damp itself. So what are the causes and sources of damp? Well, we do have our good old friend rising damp, and that we cannot ignore completely. But as I will often say, as I'm sure many of you have seen me quoted as it is said that I once said rising damp doesn't exist. That's not strictly true. I believe rising damp is in fact one of the rarest forms of dampness. And in fact, in my experience, it's the one that I'm least concerned about when I'm looking at buildings. However, leaks, whether they be from a roof or from gutters or anything like that, penetrating damp, perhaps through neglect of joinery leading to gaps opening up, or perhaps pointing that has weathered and hasn't been looked after. And then, of course, we've got lateral water penetration. Perhaps we've got high ground levels and water's just simply penetrating laterally. And of course, we can have trapped moisture where modern materials have been used and have effectively trapped moisture within the construction. And of course, salts can, hygroscopic salts in particular, can create a damp problem or the appearance of a damp problem. And I find that condensation is perhaps the most common cause of damp at the moment and for some years. Now, on the left here, you'll see an image of a publication that I have been privileged to work on with others. It's been produced by the RICS, Historic England, and the Property Care Association, amongst others. It hasn't yet been published in full. We have put it out as a draft, and I'm sure many of you would have seen links to it, and I'd encourage you to look out for it. But I have been told literally within the last couple of weeks that it should soon go for publication. It is in the final throes of consultation, and we're hoping that it will be published later this year or early next year. But it will give you a methodology of how to consider damp when looking at historic buildings. We say traditional buildings. However, I would argue that these methods apply to any building. Okay, so let's move on to look at moisture control. And here on the left, you'll see a sketch that is probably familiar to many of you. It's produced by SPAB, and it shows you how buildings historic buildings function, how they manage moisture. And that's the important thing about traditional buildings. They do tend to manage moisture, and that's how they function. Whereas modern buildings exclude moisture. Now, you may be looking at the bottom right-hand corner and think, why has he put a picture of a couple of coats there? Well, it's quite simply an analogy that I like to use, that of the woolen overcoat and of the plastic Mac. The woolen overcoat will create a nice layer that it keeps you warm. You go out into rainy weather and it will absorb that moisture and release it. If you are building up a sweat as you walk along, that moisture from your sweat will evaporate through the coat and you remain relatively dry or completely dry because the coat manages the moisture. When it comes to a plastic Mac can be very effective in completely excluding moisture. That is until that little bit of rain gets in at the neck or down a seam somewhere, and it gets in and starts to annoy you because it can't get out again. Because once moisture's in, it can't get out. And of course, if you're walking along building up a sweat, where's that sweat going to go? It's just going to stay within the envelope of that plastic Mac, and you just get wetter and wetter because the whole principle is to keep moisture out. What it can't cope with is moisture once it gets beyond that barrier. And that's often the problem we find when we look at traditional buildings and modern buildings, and the differences where traditional buildings have had a modern approach applied to them. Now let's move on to think about timber defects, because damp can lead to a number of defects. And here we see some images of some of the typical problems we find. So we have some rots, and here you'll see an image of a nice fruiting body, nice and active by the looks of it there. And you see some images of the sort of damage that can be caused by the different forms of rot. Now, I'm not going to go into the different types of rot today. That's a different talk altogether. But the important thing is to remember that all forms of rot start with a damp problem. And unless you resolve the damp problem, you are not going to deal with the rot. You can throw as much chemical as you like at the problem, but it won't solve it. You've fundamentally got to deal with the damp and the source and the cause of the damp first. Without that, you won't solve the rot problem. Similarly, with beetle attack, most of these beetles, those pictures are magnified quite a few times. These beetles are not very big. Their jaws are even smaller, and they're physically incapable of chewing into well-seasoned, dense timber. So what damage do they cause? Well, they can cause damage when the timber is damp and when it's deteriorating. So generally speaking, when we're looking at historic buildings, if you see active beetle infestation, it means there's an elevated moisture problem, and that has to be looked at. Now, with common furniture beetle, it is possible to control it to a degree with chemical treatment, but certainly with death watch beetle, chemical treatment is largely ineffective, and you have to look at holistic methods of dealing with it. Again, these are matters for a separate discussion, but I just highlight the problems that these timber defects and deterioration of timber is nearly always linked to dampness. So what are the remedial works that we can carry out? Well, the first thing is to identify the cause or the causes of the dampness, and therefore the rot or the infestation. And we then have to think about repairing or removing the causes. That might involve ventilating voids, rooms, lowering ground levels, repairing leaks, maintenance, etc. Now, the use of chemical treatment, such as retrospective injection of damp-proof courses, is, in my view, rarely effective, rarely necessary, and is certainly a last resort, partly because it's irreversible. So I would say that we need to look at the building holistically and think about what is really happening to that building and not rely on chemicals to solve the problem. We need to ensure there's a suitable maintenance regime to avoid future problems. And sometimes that means adjusting lifestyle, because some people simply don't know how to open windows and air a building. And that sometimes is all that's necessary. But there are times when we might need to amend the detailing. I remember hearing of the Brighton Pavilion many years ago that suffered a major rot problem because the rainwater disposal meant that water was going into the building. And as part of the process of dealing with the rot, they had to actually amend the rainwater disposal system. So sometimes when we look at these buildings, we have to think about that. If you think back to the evolution of building that I spoke about earlier, and the creation of a parapet where a parapet didn't previously exist, that in itself can be problematic. And sometimes we need to think about how we deal with these issues and amend detailing if necessary to ensure that the building doesn't suffer unduly in future. So some of these remedial works, they're listed there. Targeted treatment might be appropriate in some instances. Isolate vulnerable materials from dampness, etc. These are all options that we need to think about with remedial works. But of course, what are some of the typical problems we come across when we look at repairs to buildings? And this isn't only timber and damp, but generally. Well, I find that one of the biggest problems is simply ignorance. The fact that the builders, the professionals, the owners simply do not understand what they're dealing with. And so ignorance is something we have to deal with. And sometimes it is a matter of educating the clients, the builders, and so on and so forth. The other problem is a desire for quick fix solutions. Quite often people want a quick solution to their problem. They don't want to wait. And damp problems in particular can take a while to sort out if we're going to deal with it properly. But people tend to be rather not wanting to wait for the works to come into effect and for the problem to be resolved over time. And there is an over-reliance on chemical solutions and using modern materials and modern approaches inappropriately. There's a lack of adequate defect analysis. People don't understand the buildings as I've gone through today. We need to understand what we're dealing with. And this can lead to a poor identification of problems, a lack of detailed schedule of works, and sometimes leaving the builder to get on with resolving the problem. And then when work is undertaken, not checking it to make sure it's been dealt with properly. And then again, no maintenance regime thereafter. Now, in this session, I've been talking in general terms about historic buildings. I've mentioned historic and traditional buildings. But what do I mean by that? I generally mean buildings that were constructed in the materials and ways that we've been talking about. And that tends to be prior to about 1920. And some years ago, some research was undertaken that indicates that about 1 in 5 of the residential building in this stock in this country dates from prior to about 1920. So it is a significant number of buildings that we're talking about. And these principles and some of the things I've been talking about are not only applicable to those listed buildings, but any traditional building. But now let's move on to our third and final P, that of planning. I want to deal firstly with some of the common myths. I come across these quite regularly, and I'm sure you do as well. Only the exterior is listed. Only what's mentioned in the list description is listed, and often that is only the exterior. Or only the features mentioned in the description are listed. Or the modern extension isn't part of the listed building, is it? Or the final one I come across quite regularly is, well, it's only grade 2. It hasn't got the same level of protection as grade 1 and 2 star buildings. These are all myths that we need to deal with and knock on the head fairly quickly. So what is the reality? Well, the reality is that the legislation does not mention list descriptions. A list description has no legal bearing apart from the address itself. The list descriptions that we see nowadays are more helpful than they were in the past, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But it is important that the list description, no matter how detailed or not, it has no legal bearing. The legislation is not limited to exteriors, interiors, facades, or anything. It simply says the listed building is protected by the legislation. That, of course, does lead to discussions about what is the listed building, what is curtilage, etc. Again, a talk for another day. The legislation does not mention grades. The grade is irrelevant in terms of the legislation. So all of those myths we can quickly knock on the head. So let's look at some list descriptions. So here we have two of buildings I've looked at in the past. The one on the left is a converted barn. You can see there that the list description is just 2 sentences. The barn isn't particularly spectacular as such, but I would have thought it warrants a bit more than 2 sentences. But of course, that's all we've got to go with that particular description. The one on the right is a lovely little thatched building. 3 sentences in this case. That's an improvement on the 2 sentences in the other one. But unfortunately, it still doesn't mention interiors. And in this case, there were remnants of a lovely hall house. Nothing mentioned in the list description. So how did this come about? Well, it comes about because in the 50s and 60s, when they started to list buildings, there were a number of homeowners that got whiff of the fact their building was going to be listed. And so they either made drastic alterations very rapidly, or in a few very rare examples, they demolished the building. And so it was decided that the owners of buildings wouldn't be consulted. And that meant that a lot of buildings had to be assessed from the exterior only. Now, of course, there were buildings open to the public, and buildings mentioned in books such as Pevsner or the Victoria County Histories. So there were references, and there were situations where the interiors could be inspected, but they tended to be grade 1 and grade 2 star buildings. And that's where this myth arises that grade 2 buildings, it's only the exterior, because the list descriptions often only mention the exterior. That's part of the process, unfortunately. And that's how that myth comes about. Now, in terms of what we deal with nowadays, what we need to understand, because the list description is often unhelpful, is that we need to make our own assessment of the building. We need to make an assessment of the significance of the building and how important it is, and sometimes even how accurate that list description might be. But let's just look at the legislation itself. The purpose of the legislation is to identify and record what it is that's being conserved. It also provides for the relevant authorities to be alerted when a threat arises, but it also allows for a method by which harmless or desirable works are permitted. But it can also provide sanctions when there are offences committed. So let's look at the sanctions. Well, the first one is criminal prosecution. Now, criminal prosecution can be taken against those who cause the work to be undertaken. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, it means the building owner, of course, and the builder, but it can also mean the professionals involved. And we need to understand that. It's no small thing to face a criminal prosecution. So what does that entail? Well, in the extreme, people could be sent to jail. That's very rare. It does happen, and it has happened, but it is very rare. Most of the time, it means a hefty fine, but it does mean that you've got a criminal record. And I'm sure that most of us wouldn't want that against us. So that is important. But when we're advising purchasers of a listed building, we need to bear in mind that as they didn't undertake the work or cause it to be undertaken, they are not going to face criminal prosecution. So we shouldn't worry purchasers of a building unduly with regard to criminal prosecution. However, enforcement applies to anyone who presently owns the building. So if someone is purchasing a building, they need to be aware that there could be enforcement proceedings if those enforcement proceedings are thought to be appropriate. Now, that can require reinstatement, and sometimes it can require urgent work, and usually enforcement procedures give a time frame for the works to be undertaken. It can require, in some instances, a retrospective application. Now, it's very rare that you'd put in an application for something that was done in the past. More often, what I usually advise clients to do is to incorporate those past matters that need to be resolved with any present application, so we can combine the two, and with the approval, hopefully, of the application, that then provides the consent for what has been done in the past as well as what is being proposed now. But there are situations where there may not be any action required, and that's because the enforcement or any action won't achieve anything. So, for example, if a grand fireplace has been ripped out and stolen, putting another fireplace in well, it's not the original, it's a replica, is it a good replica, etc., etc. There are so many questions. So sometimes enforcement may say, well, it's gone now, we can't do anything about it, therefore we're not going to make you do anything about it. On the other hand, there are obvious examples where they will. For example, the installation of a plastic double glazed window is something that, as far as I'm aware, most conservation officers will enforce on, and we need to be aware of that and advise our clients accordingly. Now, as far as listed building consent is concerned, there are various bodies that can provide advice, Historic England and SPAB, as well as the IHBC. Now, Historic England have recently published this booklet on listed building consent, and it is downloadable from their website and is worth looking at because it gives you some guidance. But I would always advise a client to speak in the first instance to a conservation officer about the works being proposed and submit a pre-application. And this allows a discussion to take place about the works. If in doubt, it is better to apply than face the prospect of a prosecution later down the line. As far as general guidance is concerned, I often hear the phrase like for like repair being used. Now, if you're dealing with a building that still has traditional materials, then like for like repair is a perfectly acceptable approach to the building. However, if we're dealing with a building that might have a cement render finish to it, then like for like repair is about the last thing we'd want to do. So like for like as a phrase needs to be thought about and considered very carefully. The thing about alteration is that it depends on the extent of work as to whether it is an alteration to character in terms of the nature of the building and whether it would need consent. Small repairs such as maintenance, maybe a small pocket of rot in a windowsill or a bottom corner of a frame, wouldn't normally constitute an alteration that would require consent. However, if that work is more extensive and involves replacement of a sash or a whole window, then of course listed building consent will be needed because the authorities will want assurance that you're going to put the right sort of window, the right sort of profile, etc. back into that building. And so the extent and nature of the repair needs to be carefully considered. Now, listed building consent is part of the planning regime, but it is separate from that. So listed building consent will sometimes be necessary where there is no need for planning permission or indeed no need for building regulations. And we need to think about that and advise clients accordingly. Some works that might be acceptable with modern buildings, for example, repointing a facade, you wouldn't think twice about repointing a modern building that needs it, but when it comes to a historic building, that is the sort of work that might need consent. And we need to be prepared to apply for that work and not just rush straight into it. And when you apply for consents, you need to think about the heritage statement. This is a document we need to prepare that helps to justify the works. Now, it's the heritage statement that will think about the significance of the building, the history of the building, and will think about the different component parts of that building and what can and can't be altered or should or shouldn't be altered. And then it thinks about the work being proposed and the impact of those works on that building. And that's what a heritage statement encompasses, all those different facets. When we think about works, though, I try to advise clients to think about it in different classifications. Now here I've used the traffic light system. So red is for those works for which listed building consent will definitely be necessary and may indeed be controversial. They might require very careful consideration and detailed discussions with the officers and others involved. So they're a red category. But the amber category are those works for which listed building consent would normally be required, but should be fairly straightforward. So I mentioned repointing and repairs to window. Of course, the officers will want assurances that you're going to use the right materials and do it in the right way. But subject to that, the process of getting consent should be fairly straightforward. Now, our green category are those works for which listed building consent would not normally be required. And so I tend to advise clients that when you approach a conservation officer, go to them with a list of works categorized in this way. So it makes it a lot easier to discuss the matters with them. And it may mean that you come away from that meeting knowing that there are certain things you can get on with straight away, and yet other matters for which you're going to have to prepare to put an application in. And that is often the way that smooths the process. It also encourages the conservation officer to view your client in a positive manner. Here is someone that wants to go about things in the right way and not just blunder into the building and make a mess of things. So to summarize and to finish with, I just want to look at a general summary of conservation principles. Now, I've started with understanding the building. And of course, I've gone through that and why that's important. Minimum intervention. This goes back to do as much as necessary, but do as much as necessary, but as little as possible. Respect for past works. There may be things done to that building in the past that we might regard as a bit Heath Robinson. We may question the adequacy of that work, but if it isn't causing a problem, if there's no active issue there, I would say respect that and leave it in place. Don't just blunder into making a repair simply because it's an old repair and it's not how we deal with it today. And then the next thing is be honest in your repair. You know, if you're putting in a new piece of timber, don't try and distress it to make it look old. Make it honest. This is a modern repair. These buildings have gone through many repairs over their life, and this is just another repair as part of the process. Sometimes we need to think about reversibility. If we're putting a partition into a building, we might want to think about scribing around cornices and skirtings and other details so that in future, if that partition is to be removed, its impact on that building is minimized or could hardly be seen at all. And of course, we should abstain from speculation. You know, was there an oriel bay in that window at one point? Well, maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. We don't know. Don't speculate about it. If you've got hard evidence in terms of photographs or past evidence that you can turn to, that's fair enough, but don't speculate about what might have been otherwise. And of course, we need to plan for future management and maintenance of the building. And I would suggest that all buildings that we deal with should have logbooks. Unfortunately, very few clients seem to take up this idea, but I'm all in favour of a logbook that keeps together all the documented works and the history of that building, everything in one place, so that it makes it easier for the next owner, the next generations, to understand what's been done to that building and when it took place. So those are some of the principles that I think are important. Now then, I've gone on for long enough. I'm come to my end of the main part of the talk. So some of you may be thinking, what's next? Well, as far as I'm concerned, I've set up Boniface Enterprises as a coaching experience. And my aim is to provide coaching and training to those who want to further their career in conservation or get into conservation. So that's the main aim. Now, how am I going to deal with that? Well, I've got these plans in mind. Small group training with a maximum of 10 people. Now, the first courses I'm going to produce will develop the 3 Ps further, going deeper. And I'm going to create a 3-month program where we go into some of these principles further and look at the past, the pathology and the planning in more detail. But I also want to explore specific topics. And so I will be going into more specifics in that sense. But I can offer one-to-one coaching as well. Now, this might be one-off coaching. It might be monthly recurring, or it might be a 3-month package. I'm open to discussion about whatever coaching might suit your purposes. So please speak to me if that might interest you. And then as for future plans, I'm going to create the 3 Ps Building Conservation Hub. This is going to be a private online resource where people can join, my clients can join, and they can communicate with each other. I'll provide a live Q&A once a month, and there will be opportunity to help each other along and develop their careers further through a private online hub. I will be producing specific videos or podcasts on topics and with some special guests. So one of the topics I've got in mind is a video or a set of videos looking at thatch and thatching. And I've got a couple of special guests in mind for interview for that subject. And then eventually, when I eventually find some time to do it, I'm going to write a series of books based on the 3 Ps. So look out for that in future. Now, if you're interested, there are my contact details. I'm sure many of you would have received that through the Eventbrite anyway. So please feel free to contact me if you're interested in anything in future. And that's it for now. Thank you very much. Those are some of the buildings I've dealt with over the years. And I finish with the quote of William Morris about the fact that we're looking after these buildings for the future generations that come after us. So that's the end of my main presentation. Now I'm quite happy to take some questions here. So I'm going to end the slideshow and hopefully, there we are. Hopefully you'll be able to see me now. And I don't know if we've got any questions. So I'm now going to have a look. I see a couple of people have put some things in the chat. So let's see that. Now, hopefully, someone says, is there any sound yet? So hopefully you were able to hear me through that and there was no problem there. Yep, I can hear okay. Do you include Queen Anne style Bedford Park in arts and crafts? Right, that's an interesting question. I mean, during the Victorian period, there were several throwbacks to previous periods when you get the neo-Gothic, neo-classical, neo-Queen Anne. And so I suppose the arts and crafts period took up some of those previous styles and developed it further. So I wouldn't call it Queen Anne. It's a Queen Anne style, but it's not an original Queen Anne as such. When was the first semi-detached house built? Oh, that's a good question. I recently looked at some medieval buildings that were constructed as a terrace for workers. And so I suppose one could assume that workers' cottages were developed way back into the medieval period. I don't think there is a time when you'd say a first semi-detached house. Certainly during the Georgian period, you see many semi-detached houses, and I believe there were quite a few before then. But yes, semi-detached, certainly terraced from way, way, way back. Now, Alison, my assistant, has posted a link to a Survey Monkey. I'd appreciate if you could fill that in. That would be extremely helpful to me. Yep, so I'm just quickly scrolling through these chats. Thank you for your comments. Let's see if we've got anything in the Q&A. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. If anyone wants to pose a question in the Q&A, please let me know. Otherwise, I think I've answered all the questions there. I've got no open questions showing. So, here we are. Thank you, Michael. What do you think about internal wall insulation on a rubble stone wall barn conversion? The thing about insulation of buildings generally is a topic in itself, is quite a fraught topic. Quite simply, wall insulation is best if applied to the exterior of a building. But of course, with historic buildings and rubble stone buildings, you're not going to want to put that on the exterior. So internal wall insulation is probably the second best approach. The only thing I'd say about wall insulation, look at the moisture profile across the wall and make sure you're not creating an interstitial condensation problem. But beyond that, I'd also say, think about the gaps. If you're insulating a ground floor and a first floor, what about the floor void and the wall within that void? You need to think about insulating that so you don't create a cold bridge or a cold gap. So that are the sort of things I think need to be considered. The other thing I would say is that there has been some innovation with insulating plasters in recent years. And I'm thinking about lime plasters that have got insulating aggregates added into them. And so that's the sort of thing that you could look at. And you'd need to look at how they would perform and what benefit they provide you. But hopefully that's a quick answer to your question. Will you be giving guidance on energy performance and sensitive upgrading? I can do. There are other courses available. A friend of mine down in Wales does do courses on upgrading old and listed buildings, and particularly on energy performance. And he is one person I'm thinking of interviewing and getting involved in some of my work in future. So that is something I've got in mind, yes. And Marianne Sir, who is a good friend of mine, Marianne and I formed the Building Conservation School some 20 years ago after a chance meeting and a coffee at Paddington Station. We created the summer school, and she has written a book on energy performance that is well worth reading as well. And that's available from SPAB. And the next question is a diploma in conservation the best or only route? Well, it's certainly not the only route, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's the best route. Nowadays, the diploma I did is now a master's, but certainly some form of formal training is not a bad thing. It is something that I would recommend if you're able to. But of course, it doesn't suit everyone. And some of the courses are part-time or full-time, and that may not suit. So one of the reasons I've set up what I'm doing is to help people develop their careers and to gradually explore conservation and take small steps. I started from not knowing anything and had to take small steps. So I look back on my experience and think that's how I think people can learn. By gradually getting into things, gradually dipping their toe into different areas of work. And so, yes, that's the sort of thing that I will help. But my intention is that I will supplement some of these other things. So it is not my intention to take over from diplomas, masters, or anything like that. My intention is to supplement and help individuals or small groups in conservation training. So hopefully that's helpful. Right, I don't see any more questions there. I see some more questions or comments in the chat. Yeah, what's this? Any views on retrofitting a damp-proof course, obviously along with solving leaks and other factors? As I've already said, I think that retrofitting a damp-proof course is an option. If it's a physical one, it's a very expensive option usually, and I would say it is a last resort because it is largely irreversible. And of course, the conservation officer would want it justified if you're dealing with a listed building. I'm not, the one thing about any damp proofing in a historic building is if we're starting from scratch and building a new building, we can make the damp proofing complete. We can ensure that any damp proof course, damp proof membrane is complete across the building and there's absolute continuity. When you're dealing with retrospective installation, there's always that question: are we achieving absolute continuity, or is there going to be a gap somewhere where that dampness is going to eventually get through? So one thing I would urge you to think about when thinking about retrofitting a damp-proof course is how continuous is your damp proofing, and is there a chance that you will eventually create a problem elsewhere? Okay, so that would be my initial comments on that matter. Now, have we got any more questions here? George, I see you have your hand up. Right, agreed. No, I think, oh, George, you've got your hand up. I don't know if I've answered your question. Was that answered? I can't see any more questions. I think I've gone through, I've just spotted another question here, quite a lengthy one. Let's see, sorry about this. This is from Claire. An observation on the relationship with conservation officers. Your advice on a good relationship with CO was really welcome. Yes, I strongly recommend you get to know your CO, get to know whether they like proper coffee or tea, and look after them, because it is vital that you deal with the CO properly and they are confident that you're going to take the right approach. Yeah, Claire says they often find people that say we don't want to make changes and then a bit upset when they can't put double glazing in. Unfortunately, she mentions estate agents. Unfortunately, estate agents and some of those involved in the process of buying houses are not the best informed when it comes to listed buildings. Indeed, sadly, I find that solicitors aren't always very well informed either. I sometimes get solicitors questioning me and saying, can you please explain what a listed building is? So it is something that we need to deal with. Anyway, right, here we are from Neil. In terms of education, there are several places that offer CPD and alongside, yes, that's true. There are many CPD opportunities, so do look out for them. And yep, I'm just reading what Neil said. Much depends where you are in the country. That's true. So for example, in Essex, in the pre-COVID, Essex County Council used to run courses at Cressing Temple. And I'm aware there are other courses across the country as well. So look out for those day courses and just things that are going on. Marianne and I and Duncan Phillips, who are going to be continuing with the Building Conservation School, are thinking about doing standalone day courses as well. And we're going to be looking at lime, and I'm looking at thatch. So look out for those. If you're interested in finding out more about those, please let me know, and I can put you on a mailing list to know about the Building Conservation Summer School, but also the day courses that we're going to run on the back of that. So look out for those. Let me know if you're interested, and I'll send you information. So I think, what we got, one more message. George, yes, you had your hand up. Often experience resistance to extensions to this. I'm designing one that promotes a contemporary design. Try to avoid using materials that are similar. Do I have a view? Well, I think this is always a difficult one. Should we design in a modern style, or should we design in a more traditional style? I think there are arguments for and against, and often it will depend on the specific building. I've seen some fantastic modern extensions to buildings, but I've seen some pretty awful ones as well. On the other hand, some extensions that follow the traditional style end up being a bit of a pastiche. And I think that can be as bad as an awful modern extension. So I'm sorry to evade the question. I think it's a matter of the building itself, the skill of the designer, the architect, and often the experience of the conservation officers, because ultimately, if you're dealing with a listed building, it'll be the conservation officer that makes that final call. And some of them have differing levels of experience. Some of them come from a design and a background, architectural background, whereas some of them come from a more hands-on building background. So it depends who you're dealing with. But certainly it is very much a case of speaking to the conservation officer, dealing with the client, and coming up with a solution that is well designed, whether it's modern, contemporary, or whether it's in the traditional or the vernacular style. It should be well designed. That's the important thing. Okay, I think that's the end, and I see we've been going well over an hour. So I would, I've just spotted that someone else, a couple more questions have appeared in the Q&A. Sorry about that, I'm jumping ahead here. Could you survey a house with a damp meter? Well, you can. I'm not sure whether the results will be any help to you. But it is important that you understand the limitations of whatever you use to assess a building. And so if you're using a damp meter, it is a tool. It's one that I do use sometimes, but I use it understanding its limitations, and I use it in a correct manner, in a way that I think is most helpful to me in assessing the problem with that building. Is that book behind you 501 about Brian Lara? No, it's not. It's about the Harrier squadrons that went down to the Falklands. Behind me, you'll see conservation and buildings in the middle, and aeroplanes on the left, or on your right, I think. But anyway, thank you for that. I think that's all. I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you for attending. Look out for the recording. We'll send it out to you. And I look forward to seeing you, some of you again at some future date, at some event, or hopefully some of you may like to become one of my clients for the coaching. Anyway, thank you very much and good day. Thank you. Bye.